We are now going to talk about another popular agile methodology called Kanban. So, what you can see in front is a typical Kanban board. We'll get into the details of each of the aspects of this. So, Kanban literally means a visual card or a signboard or a billboard, and it was developed by Toyota to reduce the inventory tied up in work in progress, which helps both in reducing the cost as well as output. It's one of the key aspects of lean development. So why use Kanban in software development? Well, the methodology for time boxing, like in Scrum, sometime is not effective in addressing all the different needs. For example, in our own development practice, we use Scrum primarily for the development activities, while we move to Kanban for the maintenance. So sometimes the time box is an obstacle. For example, if certain bugs are reported and needs to be fixed immediately, the user is not ready to wait for the end of the sprint. Neither can you add the bug in between the sprint, which violates the key Scrum rules. So having a process like Kanban is effective, while in some other cases where there's a very small development team, like 1 to 2 person working on the product, we found the Kanban to be more effective. So let's look at some of the problems stated here. So sometime short time boxes becomes an obstacle, and there are also pressure from the time box. Sometime there's not enough quality requirement documents being prepared because everyone is rushing to meet the time box start of the next sprint, or sometime testing and others which starts a bit late, and that causes problem. So for example, in this diagram you can see the development starts ahead and followed by the testing, but the development might take up to the end of the sprint, while the testing do not have enough time to test the last few features and outputs, and can have a issue in terms of quality. There are ways in Scrum to address it, but some team finds this to be a difficulty and they prefer to go for Kanban. So using Kanban approach in software drops the time box iteration in favor of a continuous flow. So how to set up a simple Kanban system for software development? So this one is a diagram. This is a physical Scrum, or rather Kanban board. It can also be done using a electronic or a digital web-based system. But let's first understand what are the key components in it and how to go about it before we talk about how it can be adapted on an online system. So this basically represents the typical flow. It identifies elaboration and acceptance criteria, development, test, deployment, etc., as may be relevant for the shop floor. Now there's another important part, which is basically in this physical board, it's handled by creating a separate express lane at the top. It can also be done, let's say in an online system, by creating color coding for different lanes, or so what is the express lane? Like For example, you have a certain activities ongoing and there's a new bug or a new emergency item that came in, and it's a highest priority. So the team actually drops what they have in hand in favor of prioritizing the item and ensuring it's done ahead of everything else. Now, in Kanban, there is it follows the key pull principle. So, whoever is in charge of a specific lane picks up the item from the previous, and once they're done with it, puts on the done section of the lane. So, for the next individual, next lane in charge to pull from that, it's not pushed to the next lane till the other person is ready to pull it on their own side. Now, work in progress limit per lane is an important concept in Kanban, and each lane has a certain ideal limit set to the work in progress. So, for example, let's say one of this lane, you do not want more than 2 items to be worked on at the same time, and in that case this kind of shows like an empty slot. So it shows like there's one more task that can be pulled and so forth. So it's and in any time when there's a pile up on a certain lane, the other team members kind of stop the other part of the process and join in to help move those forward to figure what's the problem, what's the bottleneck, and solve it. These are the list of goals. So it basically creates a visual representation so that everyone is aware of what are the key goals for the development for the software to be shipped, and it's always kept in clear vision so that everyone can take note of it and always remembers. So start the board by placing stories or features in queue, which is basically the second lane. You see, the first one is the goals, the second lane is the queue, and you mark the date, or rather the product owner marks the date in which they expect each of those to be picked up and pulled. Then once it's finished, it's marked with the end date, and of course the attention is put on the flow or the bottlenecks, and the whole team is focused on ensuring that there is a continuous flow happening. Now the cycle time, which is a typical time spent per average item to be moved from the queue to the done state, is what a lot of attention is paid on. Though sometimes it might be challenging with the different size items in the queue, but focus is paid in Kanban to try to bring all the tasks to a similar size flow or similar size item, so the flow can be continuous and more or less uniform cycle time. This is an example of use of Kanban in a Disneyland board. So if you see, each of these rides have certain cycle time mentioned, and it's a just a sample rather than exact way of showing what can be done, but it's an important way to see. And if some let's say Peter Pan's flight has a longer time, someone can look at it and see what can be done to reduce the wait time on that. Let's look at this example on how things are processing. Let's say you have a large story and how it can be broken down into setup task so that you can move the task, and once all the tasks are completed, then the story is considered completed. This is a view of cumulative flow diagram. It kind of shows how much of the work is in progress and what has been done. This is another example. So as you can see, the yellow, which is basically a work in progress ticket, is kind of kept within about 50 or so points on a regular basis, while the one at the top is the waiting inventory of ticket that needs to be worked on. So it's it basically gives a visibility on how the team is performing and identifying at any point of time if there is a built up on the work in progress, and find, or even built up on the number of tickets, and finding a solution which addresses it. So start the board by placing stories or features in queue, which is basically the second lane. You see, the first one is the goals, the second lane is the queue, and you mark the date, or rather the product owner marks the date in which they expect each of those to be picked up and pulled. So setting up a simple Kanban system starts to focus the team on the cycle time of the delivered work and give a way to detect and begin to resolve bottlenecks to ensure a smooth flow can be achieved. Okay, so let's look at again another example of the key components of a Kanban board. So there is the backlog. There can be a list of goals on the left hand side. Then there's the design, development, QC. Those are the three criteria or three lanes that's defined. There can be more than those. Each has doing and done state. If you notice, there is a work in progress, in this case written as 3 in each. Now below that there is a done criteria. So like for each lane, so let's say design, what are the criteria that needs to be achieved before we can consider that the design for that specific item is done, and so forth for each of the other lanes. And you see from the backlog, through the 3 steps, it's brought to production to be considered complete. The brownish grayish box basically shows some of the key components of what the info that is on a Kanban card. So you can see there is the story, of course, similar to any agile story. Then there's a deadline, or there can be a start time defined there when it has to be picked up, and once someone pulls it, the name of the person goes into it. And there can be also prioritization, expedite lane by the color, or it can also be, if there's a blocker, there can be a color code to define. So this is more in line with how some of the other online boards are there. There is generally no sizing or time estimate, and it's the focus is to basically ensure there's a continuous flow that's achieved. Let's do a comparison between a Scrum board and a Kanban board. So if you typically look at the day one of a sprint, in the backlog lane, all the stories are there, and in the mid sprint, you see by priority things are moving, and ideally by the last day of the sprint all the stories have moved to the done lane. However, in a Kanban board, that's not the case. We'll go to that, but before that, let's also, the other thing is the team dynamics. So the Scrum team works together to move all the tickets from one side to the other, and that's the basic focus of the team. It's only one team and there is no division, no clear divided assignment of work. While in a Kanban, any day, whether it's the first day or the last day, there is always tickets on every lane. In fact, it's defined by the work in progress that you want to maintain. And the team in Kanban could be similar as a single unified team like Scrum, or it can have different roles defined. For example, in the example 2, let's say the first lane, let's say that's the design lane, is managed by, let's say, architect team, and they might be purely working on that lane and moving task item to be ready for development, while the development team picks up those and builds on that. And there can be a third team, that's the testing team, which picks up all the done item on the development and proceeds with testing before they can be put to production. So division of work and teams is possible in a Kanban system. That would be all. You may like to refer to some of this other information and info on Kanban. These are some of the reference items. Thank you very much.